In the heart of Texas, where the sun sets over the endless plains, there are places forgotten by time. Abandoned churches, silent witnesses of secrets and terror. Prepare to enter a world where past and present meet in a macabre dance. 5 stories, 5 churches, a state of terror. Texas, a place where faith and fear mix in an atmosphere of suspense and horror. Let's explore together these true horror stories that took place in abandoned churches in Texas. Are you prepared to face the unknown? But first, don't forget to comment, where are you watching me from? Texas, known for its vastness and natural beauty, hides dark secrets in its abandoned churches. From the desert region of Terlingua to the historic towns of Granbury and Jefferson, each location has its own horror story to tell. In this journey, we will delve into 5 true horror stories that took place in abandoned Texas churches, exploring the mysteries, secrets, and inexplicable events that occurred within these sacred places. Get ready for a journey into the heart of terror, where reality and fiction mix in an atmosphere of suspense and horror. The 4 stories. The Midnight Bell, Marfa, Texas. Confessions in Terlingua, Terlingua Ghost Town, Texas. The Last Mass at Port Neches, Texas. The Whispers of Granbury, Granbury, Texas. Discover the stories, discover the horror. The Midnight Bell, St. Peter's Methodist Church, Marfa, Texas. In 2019, Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old photographer specializing in abandoned architecture, drove to Marfa, Texas, to document the former St. Peter's Methodist Church. The 1887 Victorian building, with its faded red brick walls and broken stained glass windows, stood out against the orange sky of the Texas sunset. The church's interior was a mosaic of shadows and filtered light, with dark wooden pews covered in a fine layer of red desert dust. The altar, still preserved, held a solid oak cross and a pulpit ornamented with intricate carvings, silent witnesses to more prosperous times. Sarah started her work at 5 p.m., taking advantage of the golden hour for her photographs. While capturing images of the main hallway, he noticed something strange. Despite its neglect, there were fresh marks on the dusty floor, as if someone had been dragging something heavy. At 7:45 p.m., when the sun had set and Sarah was only using her artificial lighting, the first incident occurred. The tower's bell, which hadn't rung for decades, made a muffled sound, as if someone had touched it lightly. Sarah initially attributed the noise to the strong wind characteristic of the region. Continuing her work on the second floor, where the choir was located, Sarah discovered a log book dated 1956. While leafing through it, she found a disturbing entry about the church's last reverend, Thomas Walker, who apparently went mad after claiming that voices, they called him every midnight to ring the bell. At 11:30 p.m., as she was organizing her gear to leave, Sarah heard distinct footsteps upstairs. Going up to investigate, he found all the choir chairs arranged in a perfect circle, different from how they looked in his previous photos. In the center, there was a single candle lit. The real terror began at 11:55 p.m. The bell began to ring rhythmically, even without wind. Sarah ran to the first floor, but all the doors were locked. Through the broken stained glass windows, local residents reported seeing an intense light moving inside the church, accompanied by the sound of chanting. At 12:15 a.m., Sarah was found by the local sheriff, Jack Thompson, unconscious on the altar steps. His photographic equipment was intact, but all of the photos from that night were completely black except for one. The image showed a figure in clerical robes standing next to the bell, his face blurred in a circular motion. Sarah spent 3 days in the Marfa hospital with a mild concussion and no memory of the 2 hours between 11:55 p.m. and 1:55 a.m. The only details she could remember were the sound of a choir singing in Latin and the strong smell of burning wax. Further investigation revealed that in 1956, Reverend Walker disappeared after ringing the midnight bell. His body was never found, but his diary, discovered weeks later, contained pages and pages of the same phrase repeated, "They call at midnight. Always at midnight." Today, St. Peter's Methodist Church remains closed to visitors. Local residents report that occasionally you can still hear the bell ringing at midnight, especially on full moon nights. Local authorities have recorded 3 similar incidents in recent years, all involving photographers or urban explorers who ventured into the church after sunset. The last page of Reverend Walker's diary, found during the 2020 renovation, contained a single sentence that still intrigues paranormal investigators: "The bell does not call the living, it gathers the dead for their last mass." Before we begin a new story, I'd like to ask, what do you think happened to Reverend Walker at St. Peter's Methodist Church? Why was he the only one to disappear completely, while Sarah survived her experience? Confessions in Terlingua. Chapel of the Holy Spirit, Terlingua Ghost Town, Texas. On a dark night in the small town of Terlingua, Texas, a disturbing discovery echoed through the ancient walls of the Chapel of the Holy Spirit. A documentary team, led by producer Diego Ramirez, had captured something inexplicable: 47 distinct voices in their recordings, when only 5 people were present in the chapel that fateful night. Dr. Lauren Williams, a respected 41-year-old parapsychologist, was intrigued by the phenomenon. Together with Tom "Flash" Gordon, a young 27-year-old photographer, they began to delve deeper into the mysteries surrounding this abandoned sacred place. The chapel, built in adobe, held stories in its cracked walls that few dared to tell. Maria Sanchez, a 92-year-old local resident, became a key piece in this supernatural puzzle. His memoirs from the 1950s revealed a dark story involving the Reverend John Harper and the disappearance of local youths after taking part in secret rituals at the chapel. In an attempt to discover the truth, the team organized a spiritualism session. Dr. Williams conducted the ritual as the night wore on, and the air inside the chapel grew thicker and thicker. The lanterns began to blink inexplicably, and an icy presence took over the room. The ancient carvings on the walls seemed to take on a life of their own, changing shape in the flickering candlelight. Maria was the first to see the female figure dressed in black, silently watching from the corner of the chapel. The voices began to speak more clearly, revealing disturbing stories of forced confessions and cruel punishments. The climax came when the presence of Reverend Harper materialized before them, his empty eyes fixed on the team as he recited an ancient prayer in a voice that mixed anger and sadness. "You summoned what you shouldn't have," his words echoed off the walls. "Now you will pay for your sin." The doors closed, trapping the team in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The air grew even colder, and the supernatural presences intensified, surrounding them with palpable evil energy. Only with the first rays of the sun did the dark presence begin to dissipate. The team emerged from the experience deeply shaken. Tom Gordon, holding his cameras with trembling hands, had captured images that defied rational explanation. Maria, watching the female figure fade in the morning light, shared her wisdom. The spirits were trapped in a cycle of pain and revenge, needing recognition and remembrance to find peace. The Chapel of the Holy Spirit kept its secrets for decades, but that night, it revealed just a fraction of its dark history. The 47 voices captured on the recordings remain a silent testimony to the inexplicable events that occurred within those sacred walls, leaving an indelible mark on all who dared investigate their mysteries. The experience in the chapel forever changed the lives of those 5 researchers, leaving them with questions that they may never find answers to. The voices of the dead continue to echo through time, reminding us that some secrets of the past refuse to remain buried in the sands of the Terlingua desert. After the disturbing events in Terlingua, where we confront the tormented voices of 47 souls trapped in a cycle of eternal confessions, our journey into the supernatural in Texas takes us to another place marked by tragedy and mystery. If you were impacted by the revelations of the Capella do Espírito Santo, prepare yourself for an even more intriguing story. In Port Neches, a small port town in southeast Texas, an old Catholic church holds a secret that forever changed the fate of its faithful. It all started on a seemingly ordinary Sunday morning, when Father Michael O'Malley was preparing to celebrate what would be his last Mass. What no one knew was that, within the next 24 hours, everyone present at that celebration would mysteriously disappear, leaving only a single survivor to tell a story that defies human understanding. What really happened during the last Mass in Port Neches? The answers may be even more disturbing than the confessions we heard in Terlingua. Port Neches, 1987. The bell of St. Elizabeth's Church echoed through the misty morning as the faithful gathered for Sunday Mass. Father Michael O'Malley, a 65-year-old man known for his unwavering devotion, adjusted his stole in front of the sacristy mirror. His hands were shaking slightly, but it wasn't because of the cold that was seeping through the centuries-old walls. That morning, something was different. The church's stained glass windows seemed to pulse with a greenish light that no one could explain. The air inside the temple was thick, as if charged with static. The 82 parishioners who walked through the church doors that morning had no idea they were about to participate in what would become known as the Port Neches mystery. Sarah Connor, a 12-year-old girl who served as an altar boy, was the first to notice something strange. During the entrance procession, she swore she saw reflections of people in the stained glass windows that did not correspond to anyone present in the church. The candles on the altar began to burn with bluish flames, but curiously, no one but her seemed to notice. When Father O'Malley began, "In the name of the Father," his voice sounded different, as if several voices were speaking in unison through him. Those present attributed this to the acoustics of the church, but Sarah realized that the Latin words he spoke were not traditional for the liturgy. During the homily, the priest began talking about portals and dimensions, about overlapping times, and about an ancient prophecy that mentioned a sacred convergence. The faithful, in a state of trance, just nodded, their eyes fixed on the altar that now seemed to emit a pulsating aura. At the moment of consecration, when the priest lifted the chalice, a low hum filled the entire room. The walls of the church began to vibrate, and a vortex of greenish light formed over the altar. Sarah, hidden behind a column, watched in horror as, one by one, those present began to fade into the light, like old photographs slowly fading. Father O'Malley was the last to disappear. Before he was completely absorbed by the light, his eyes met Sarah's, and he whispered words that the girl would carry forever: "Some are chosen to witness, others to transcend." When authorities arrived at the church hours later, they found only Sarah, huddled behind the column, clutching her rosary tightly. All 82 others present, including Father O'Malley, had disappeared without a trace. The liturgical books were open, the empty pews were still warm, and the chalice on the altar still contained unconsecrated wine. In the weeks that followed, investigators from across the country converged on Port Neches. Theories emerged and were discarded. Some spoke of mass abduction, others of a supernatural event. Recordings from the church's security cameras showed only static at the exact moment of the disappearance. Sarah Connor grew up to become a researcher of paranormal phenomena, dedicating her life to understanding what happened that morning. She discovered that the Church of Santa Isabel had been built on the ruins of an ancient indigenous temple, and that every 40 years since its construction, inexplicable events were recorded. Today, residents of Port Neches say that on Sunday mornings, especially when it is foggy, they can hear the distant echo of liturgical chants coming from the abandoned church. And some swear that, through the stained glass windows, they can see silhouettes of people kneeling in prayer, as if that last Mass had never ended, continuing eternally in some dimension parallel to ours. 30 years after the incident, Sarah Connor returned to Port Neches. His now gray hair did not diminish the intensity of his gaze that still carried the memories of that fateful morning. St. Elizabeth's Church, now an abandoned building covered in ivy, still retained a grim dignity that made locals cross the street to avoid it. Sarah had dedicated her academic life to the study of dimensional anomalies, and her research led her to a disturbing discovery. In her years of investigation, she found records of similar events in 5 other churches around the world, all built on ancient sacred sites. In each case, the disappearances occurred during religious rituals, always preceded by reports of greenish lights and overlapping voices. That autumn afternoon in 2017, Sarah walked through the church doors for the first time in 3 decades. The air still maintained that peculiar density, as if time flowed differently inside. Equipped with electromagnetic measuring instruments and spectral cameras, she began documenting anomalies that her years of experience had taught her to identify. The readings were surprising. The instruments detected energy spikes in regular patterns, like a pulse, that were more intense near the altar. But what really caught his attention was a discovery in the church's basement, ancient indigenous inscriptions that spoke of a portal between worlds, and a moment of confluence that would occur where the stars aligned with the ancestors. During her investigation, Sarah began to hear whispers, fragments of conversations that seemed to come from far away. On a few occasions, she swore she saw reflections in the stained glass windows of people she recognized from the fateful Mass, including Father O'Malley, who seemed to be trying to tell her something. One night, while analyzing audio recordings taken at the church, Sarah discovered something extraordinary. By processing the lower frequencies, voices became audible. Between static and noise, words in Latin and English mixed together, but one phrase stood out with crystal clarity: the portal will open again. Consulting ancient astronomical records and Father O'Malley's notes, which she had saved all these years, Sarah realized that a new alignment was at hand. The same celestial conditions present on the day of the disappearance would be repeated in exactly 40 years, in 2027. Even more disturbing was finding, hidden between the pages of the priest's diary, a detailed drawing of what appeared to be an interdimensional mechanism, along with notes that suggested he knew what would happen that morning. The design showed the church as a type of mystical amplifier, built precisely to channel energies at specific moments of cosmic alignment. Sarah began to understand that Father O'Malley had not just been a victim of the event, he had been its driver. The different words he had spoken during the Mass were not a mistake, but a deliberate ritual, much older than Christianity. As 2027 approached, Sarah realized she was faced with a choice: try to stop the portal from opening again or finally find out where everyone had gone. The whispers in the stained glass windows became more frequent, and the voices became clearer, as if the barrier between dimensions was becoming thinner. In her nights of vigil at the church, Sarah began to notice that the missing people didn't seem to be in agony, they seemed to be calling others to join them. And for the first time in 30 years, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the disappearance had not been a tragedy, but a transcendence. Sarah spent the next few months immersed in meticulous preparation. Father O'Malley's notes had become his guide, and each symbol, each diagram began to make sense like pieces of a cosmic puzzle. She discovered that the church was not just a portal, it was a bridge between dimensions, consciously built by those who knew secrets far beyond our worldly understanding. On the eve of the 40th anniversary of the incident, Sarah installed state-of-the-art equipment in the church. Infrared cameras, motion sensors, EVP recorders, everything to document what was to come. The electromagnetic readings were more intense than ever, and the whispers in the stained glass windows had turned into distant melodies. At 7:45 a.m. on the fateful day, Sarah occupied the same bench where she had been sitting 4 decades ago. The rising sun began to penetrate through the stained glass windows, creating patterns of light that danced across the church floor. The voices began as a soft murmur, gradually growing in volume and clarity. Sarah. A familiar voice called her. It was his mother, who had been among the missing. It's time. The air inside the church became thick, charged with static electricity. The greenish lights began to appear, first shy, then more intense, forming complex geometric patterns in the air. Sarah could see shapes materializing at the edges of her vision, silhouettes she recognized, faces she hadn't seen in 40 years. Father O'Malley appeared before her, not as a ghost, but as a solid, real presence. "You understand," he said with a serene smile. It was not an accident, it was an evolution. A passage to a plane of existence beyond the physical limitations we know. Sarah watched as the walls of the church seemed to dissolve into light, revealing an infinite space beyond them. He saw the missing, all of them, existing in a state of expanded consciousness, free from the bonds of linear time and three-dimensional space. "Why now?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "Because you were ready," replied the priest. "We needed someone to hold the truth, to understand. And now, you have a choice. Sarah looked down at her equipment, still faithfully recording every moment of that extraordinary event. She thought about all the theories she had developed, the articles she had written, the people who had called her crazy over the years. With a deliberate move, she pulled out her phone and sent one last email with all of her findings to her colleagues at the university. He attached the most important files and scheduled them to be sent in an hour. It would be his last contribution to the world he was about to leave behind. Rising from the pew, Sarah walked toward the altar, where the light was brightest. The voices of the missing now formed a harmonious, inviting chorus. She could clearly see the other side, a reality where human limitations did not exist, where knowledge and consciousness flowed freely. "I'm ready," she said, reaching out to touch the light. The moment her fingers touched the luminous curtain, Sarah Connor understood that some truths are too great to be contained on our plane of existence. Some journeys need to take us beyond the limits of the known. When the sun reached its peak that morning, Santa Isabel Church was silent again. Sarah's equipment continued recording for hours, capturing only the gentle movement of dust in the air. But in the stained glass windows, for those who know how to look carefully, they say that it is still possible to see reflections of serene smiles, echoes of a greater truth that transcends our earthly understanding. And so, the last Mass in Port Neches finally came to its true end, not as a tragedy, but as a portal to something much bigger than us all. The last broadcast, KXAS radio station, Marfa, Texas. Continued to narration. The digital clock was flashing 3:33 when Sarah realized something was wrong. The familiar hum of equipment had changed tone, transforming into something deeper, almost organic. Through the glass of the broadcast booth, the control panel lights danced in an irregular pattern she had never seen before. "Marcus," she called over the intercom, her voice shaking slightly. "Do you see this?" Silence was his only response. On the security monitor, she could see Marcus still sitting at his desk downstairs, but something about his posture was off. He was perfectly still, like a photograph. Rebecca emerged from the file room, carrying an old tape. His face was pale under the fluorescent light. "Sarah, you need to hear this. Now." The tape, dated 1952, began playing with a familiar hiss. The voice that emerged from the speakers was too clear for such an old recording. "To those who find this message, the station must be fed. The show must go on. Always. The pact cannot be broken." The air became heavy, charged with static electricity. Modern computer monitors began to display phosphorescent green codes, numbers and letters that moved as if they were alive. "That's why we've never been able to fully digitize," Marcus suddenly spoke from behind them, making them both jump. His voice sounded different, deeper, as if other voices were speaking along with his. "The station won't allow it. It needs analog. It needs human contact. It needs us." The walls seemed to pulse now, the acoustic lining rippling as if it were breathing. Through the speakers, ancient voices began to overlap, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, all broadcasting simultaneously in a growing cacophony. Sarah ran to the door, but the handle was cold, covered in a thin layer of ice. Rebecca tried to use her cell phone, but the screen only showed static, like an off-air television. "The final show is starting," Marcus announced, his eyes now completely black, reflecting the flashing lights of the equipment. "And you are our special guests." The main microphone connected on its own, its red light pulsing like a sick heart. Over the air across West Texas, the last broadcast was about to begin. And this time, Sarah, Rebecca and Marcus would be part of it, whether they wanted to or not. Radio waves cut through the desert night, carrying more than just music and words. On every frequency, in every static, the whispers of lost announcers echoed through time, calling new talent to join KXAS' eternal show. And somewhere, on a lonely Texas road, a lonely driver tunes into the radio, looking for company in the dark of night. The clock now read 4:17, and the temperature inside the station continued to drop. Sarah could see her own breath forming little clouds in the air, as the voices on the speakers became clearer and clearer. "Good evening, Marfa," a soft, ancient voice echoed through the studio. "This is Richard Blake, broadcasting live in 1952. And today, we have a very special program for you." Rebecca, shivering with cold and fear, recognized the name instantly. Richard Blake disappeared during a broadcast. His body was never found. The lights began to flicker in a hypnotic rhythm, and through the studio windows, shadows began to materialize in the desert. Dozens of them, all walking towards the station. Silhouettes of men and women dressed in clothing from different decades, all former KXAS employees. Marcus, his eyes still black as bottomless pits, sat in the main announcer's chair. His fingers slid over the controls with unearthly familiarity. "You know," he said, his voice now a blend of several others, "the magic of radio is in the intimacy. In the way our voice enters people's homes, their cars, their lives. We become part of them. And they become part of us." The control panel began to operate on its own, knobs turning, faders moving up and down, creating a chaotic symphony of sounds. Through the radio waves, voices from different eras mixed. KXAS, the voice of the desert. Keep us tuned. The show must go on. Forever. Sarah tried once more to open the door, but her hands slipped from the frozen handle. In the reflection of the glass, she saw faces, dozens of them, watching her from the other side, their eyes glowing with a greenish light similar to computer monitors. "Don't you understand?" Marcus continued, an unnatural smile spreading across his face. "The station isn't just a building. It's a portal. A place where the past and present meet in the waves of the ether. And now, you three have been chosen to join us." Rebecca, who was still holding the old ribbon, noticed that it was hot to the touch, almost burning. Uncoiling itself, the magnetic tape began to float in the air, snaking like a living snake. "And now, dear listeners," Richard Blake's voice returned, stronger than ever, "it is time for our musical number." An ancient melody began to play, distorted and reversed, as the shadows outside finally reached the station walls. The metal of the equipment groaned as if it were being twisted by invisible hands, and in the air, words began to form in frozen mist. "Welcome to the eternal show." Sarah, Rebecca and Marcus were about to discover that at KXAS, every show is live, even after death. The sound that filled the station was no longer music, it was the collective lament of all the souls captured over the decades. Sarah felt her bones vibrate with the frequency, while the walls seemed to pulse in time with an unhealthy heart. "Since 1952, Marcus said, his voice now a grotesque mix of every announcer who had ever been on KXAS, we've kept Texas entertained. Every voice you hear on the radio at night, every song that plays in the off hours, we are all of us, eternally in the air." Rebecca, still holding the floating tape, felt a force pull her toward the soundboard. "The tapes," she whispered, finally understanding. "These aren't just recordings, they're arrests." The shadows outside began to pass through the walls as if they were made of smoke. Each of them carried a familiar face to Rebecca, faces she had seen in old photographs of the station, in yellowed newspaper clippings about mysterious disappearances. "The pact is simple," Marcus continued, slowly turning in his chair to face them. "The station needs voices. It needs souls. In return, it gives us immortality on the airwaves. Eternally broadcasting, eternally alive on the frequencies of the ether." Sarah watched in horror as strands of energy began to break away from the equipment, snaking through the air like luminous tentacles. The air was so cold now that little ice crystals formed on her eyelashes. "Please," she tried to argue, "there must be another way." "Another way?" Richard Blake's voice echoed again, now coming from everywhere at once. "There is no other way. The show must go on. It always has. It always will." Computer monitors exploded in a cascade of green sparks, and the ground began to shake. From the basement, a deep, pulsing sound began to rise, as if something gigantic was awakening. And now, Marcus smiled, his teeth shining with a phosphorescent light. It's time for your mid-air test. The tapes in the files began to unwind all at the same time, forming a web of magnetic tapes that began to envelop the three victims. Sarah tried to scream, but her voice came out as pure static. Rebecca felt her body becoming lighter, as if she was being transformed into radio waves. On the main dashboard, the transmission meter began to rise to maximum, its red lights flashing frantically. And through the loudspeakers, the voices of the condemned sang in unison. Welcome to KXAS, where the show never ends. And somewhere in the darkness of the Texas desert, dozens of radios turned on by themselves, tuned to the frequency of death, ready to broadcast the newest episode of the Eternal Show. 5, 4, 3. The countdown echoed through the station, each number pronounced by a different voice from decades past. Sarah felt her body being lifted off the ground, the magnetic ribbons now glowing with a light of their own as they wrapped around her limbs. His scream was picked up by the main microphone, instantly turning into a distorted melody that echoed throughout West Texas. 2, 1. Rebecca struggled against the tapes that wrapped around her when she noticed something in the exposed files, a series of symbols engraved on the back of the shelves. Symbols identical to those hidden under the acoustic covering. Sarah, she shouted. The symbols. They're not to keep something trapped in here, they're to keep something out. The studio floor cracked, revealing a pulsing green light coming from the basement. Marcus, or what was left of him, rose from the chair, his body now a rippling mass of static and shadows. The real show is just beginning, his distorted voice announced. The entity that feeds the station, it is hungry. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on the small emergency transmitter in the corner of the room, a modern digital device, installed only the week before. A desperate idea popped into his mind. Rebecca, she shouted through the cacophony. The frequency. Digital is different from analog. Rebecca understood immediately. As the ribbons tried to drag her into the luminous abyss that opened in the floor, she managed to reach the emergency transmitter. With a quick movement, he activated the digital transmission, overriding the analog signal. The effect was instantaneous. A deafening scream echoed through the station, like thousands of voices being torn apart simultaneously. The magnetic tapes began to fall apart, turning into black dust. The shadows on the walls writhed, their shapes shattering like broken glass. "No," Marcus' voice thundered, his body beginning to disintegrate. The pact. The show. Sarah fell to the floor, dragging herself to the main panel. With the last of her strength, she pushed all the faders to maximum, forcing the digital signal to saturate every possible frequency. The entire building shook. From the depths of the basement, something ancient and terrible roared in agony as its hold on the airwaves was broken by the digital tsunami. The walls began to crack, decades of horror and suffering being released in seconds. "Run!" Sarah shouted, pulling Rebecca towards the door, which was now unlocked. They managed to exit the building just as the first ray of sunlight touched the desert horizon. Behind them, Station KXAS imploded in a silent explosion of green light and static. In the air, just white noise.